Welcome to The Stumbling Spirit, contemplations on the path of resilience. Whether you realize it or not, you are resilient. It's your birthright. As you take in your next breath, know this truth. It's not only about your capacity to overcome difficult situations, but it's about your courage to do the necessary work to heal, learn, grow, and move forward. What you gain is invaluable wisdom. And it's through these hard stumbles in life that we often discover a new purpose that aligns with our spirit. My name is Fabio da Silva Fernandez, Reiki Master, Mindfulness Coach, and Mystical Explorer. Join me weekly as the Stumbling Spirit podcast highlights the lives of extraordinary people like you, sharing transformative stories and beneficial practices of resilience to guide you on your wellness journey. Imagine your first memory being the frightful sight of your beloved mother forced into a car by your detached father and sent away to a psychiatric hospital for weeks at a time. Imagine being blamed for your mom's mental illness. This distressing scene repeated a number of times throughout Donna Armstrong's lonely childhood and laid the fractured foundation of family dysfunction that included emotional neglect, sexual abuse, and silence. Donna broke her silence with her gripping memoir, Getting Here from There, the first 10 years. Her raw account is an exploration of her life experiences, trauma, heartache, struggles, and her rise to becoming a successful Crown attorney. Now retired, Donna joins us to discuss her powerful book and how she got here from there. It's a pleasure to welcome Donna Armstrong to the show. Hi, Donna. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. One of the things I really appreciated about your book is how you structured it. And it's written as if it's a journal, and it feels like I'm reading your diary. You take us into your world of exploration of your life experiences and trauma. And what I appreciated about it as well is how you take us backwards and forwards through time. And sometimes you'll revisit an event over and over again. And as you do, there are sort of layers that are lifted off of the experience and you uncover something new. What inspired you to write your book in that way?
Interesting, funny story. I had been journaling for a long time. And as it progressed, I sort of thought of it entered my mind that I might turn it into something more than just a journal. One day I entered to journal, and by this time I'd already sort of had the idea that I was going to turn it into something more, like a memoir, a book, that kind of thing. I entered my computer to start typing. It went crazy. All the words jumbled, everything was like, and I thought, oh my God. And I couldn't type in anything. It was all just a jumble. And it disappeared. My whole journal. Like I had like hundreds of pages of my journaling. It disappeared. I went to the Geek Squad to say, okay, nothing ever disappears. Like it's still there. They couldn't find it. It was gone.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. And it was like, oh my God. And I was thinking, okay, this is some kind of message that you're not supposed to do this. But instead, I started up again in a totally different way. And it was though it was like, that was shit. Now we're going to get you on the right path and do this the way it should be done. And the form of it sort of, I had this idea of doing it in decades and I liked the journaling thing and that sort of came in, but the structure of it sort of took a form of its own. It was really interesting, but it was like someone like the universe or something was saying, no, 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 no. That was crap. If you're going to do this, you're going to do it right and you're going to do it in a very different way. And that's how it started. And it was like the decade thing that sort of felt good because it felt manageable. Writing in 10 years, like those were things, oh yeah, I can remember what was going on in that 10 years and then that 10 years. And then it just felt like I kept going back and forth. And the digging part, it was like, oh, here's another layer. I'd forgotten about that. And here's another layer. And it was like, oh, I'm ready to go there. I remember that. I'm ready to go there now. And then, of course, I mean, there is the editing process that comes into play. But it was a really interesting process, but started out with this total loss of everything and starting over, starting again.
There are certain books that I read that I forget about, and there are other books that stay with me, and your book stays with me.
I'm so glad.
I mean, it definitely is a difficult read, but it's also an honest portrayal and candid portrayal of your life. And I really appreciate your courage to be able to write your story.
Thank you.
The other thing that I noticed was the environment in your story is a character in itself. You were brought up in a small town, farming community, and you go to great length and detail to describe that life. And it reminded me of Little House on the Prairie in a way. You know, that sort of vision of ironing clothes with the iron that you would heat on the stove or the wood oven that you had in your home and the one room schoolhouse that you went to and all of that. It really created a scene for that life that you lived growing up. How important was that in telling your story?
Oh, hugely important. And now that I'm doing this in person under my own name, I can do the great reveal and say that that community is a place near Palmerston, Ontario. So that's the area that we're talking about. And it was a very small, townish, small minded, small farming community. But it was, I think, in telling my story, it became so apparent to me how important our culture is, like where we're born. It's like who we're born to, obviously, our parents, but it's their background. They were farmers. I come from a long line of farmers. And so I was born into this established culture. And like I moved away from it fairly early, like I went to university, and I was eager to get away from that small minded community. But when I started writing, I realized, oh my God, that culture, that had so much of an impact on my life and a really like important influence, a very positive influence in some ways. Like my connection to nature is still there. My love of animals is still there. And like knowing where things come from, knowing where my food comes from, being a vegetarian. I don't want to eat meat because I grew up with animals. Like, and yet I grew up in a culture that was very meat, like we had meat every meal. There were things I rejected about that culture for sure as I moved into my adult life. But, and I'm glad, like, it's interesting you characterize it as a character because it is. It was like this other being in my life. And it was always there. It was always informing our day. Like what we did in a day was because of the weather. We were very connected to nature and the weather. And it was a huge part of who I became. And I really appreciated going back and experiencing that because I moved to the city. I became an urban dweller. But that part of me is still, it's still informing who I am.
I can imagine that it will always be with you.
I hope it is. I now love the fact that I was born on a farm. I used to, when I was introducing my background, I never really had anything to talk about in social things. Like I was always sort of a little bit, not embarrassed, but just like that people wouldn't understand. City dwellers don't understand farmers. And we sort of grew up with that, with town versus farm, that kind of thing. It was always sort of there. But I used to think, well, what am I going to talk to with people? Like how you milk a cow? Like, nah, I don't think people really want to talk about that in a party or anything. But now I boast about it. Like I introduce myself if I'm meeting someone new. I grew up on a farm. And I'm proud of it. And it's interesting that people are now interested in that.
There is that sort of return to nature that's taking place right now, and being connected with the land and being connected with fresh produce and all of that. It's definitely something that's happening right now for sure.
Yeah, like I feel like I'm sort of in again because I know where things come from. Like we were always organic. Now it's a huge deal to be organic. I grew up organic.
And I found that too in reading your book. I was like, oh, these are amazing skills, and I don't know how to do any of them. Because I was born and raised in the city, right?
Come on, Fabio, you haven't milked a cow? Like, come on.
Never. You are the youngest of six. And what struck me was how lonesome you felt growing up in a full household. And you describe certain circumstances that explain why that is. But I'm wondering, now that you look back at that period of time, do you ever wonder why or how that could ever be, that in a full house, someone could feel so lonely?
Good question. I struggled with that for years. Like I couldn't figure out why I felt so lonely with all these people around. And it was, I don't know, there's a lot of factors, I suppose. I didn't feel like I was wanted. I felt like they blamed me for being born. Like my older siblings, I think, and maybe rightfully, thought that if my youngest brother and I hadn't been born, their situation would have been better. And there may have been some truth in that because our resources were stretched. I never really felt that because another thing about being on a farm, you never feel poor because you always have food. By some standards, we would have been poor. I never felt poor. But the lonely piece, like I never felt like I belonged there, not necessarily in the environment, but in that family. And they sort of went out of their way to not make me feel welcome. I don't really understand it. I mean, I got born into that family, but I don't feel like they wanted me or that I was welcome. So I always felt like I was trying to be a part of something that I wasn't and I didn't want to be. And it was the people, not the place. Like I always sort of kept a low profile. Like I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I would find places that I could go that nobody else went. And I would go there to be by myself because in some ways I felt better being by myself than I did being with my family. It was just this feeling of not belonging. That's an awful feeling.
Yeah, I was struck also that the sibling that you're closest to is Wallace. And it was curious to me that in high school, he would tell his friends that you were adopted, and he's the closest person in your family.
Well,
And
that
I
says
was
a lot
like,
right there.
and I thought that to be odd.
Yeah, I mean, at the time it felt like a joke, and at the time I got to say I didn't really mind because I felt adopted. Like I felt like I didn't belong in this family anyway, but he did it more as, well, every joke has a certain amount of truth to it. I'm not sure what that's about. And even if I ask him now, I don't know that I would get an honest answer about that. He would turn it into a joke again. But it was just another example of me not feeling like, I remember thinking, I sort of feel adopted and that's okay with me. Like, I really
Mhm.
don't want to belong to this family.
What I really appreciated about your book is that you were able, despite the trauma that you experienced, that you're able to identify the things that you really appreciated about your upbringing. And you mentioned the connection that you had not only with Wallace, but with your mom and your grandfather. And I really appreciated that. And you shared those very special moments that you had with your mom growing up. It was very visual for me, when you describe those moments where you're with your mom and you're reading books with her and pulling out the chest of books and having that moment with her where you're having cinnamon toast and, kicking your feet by the wood oven and having those very special moments with her. And also your grandfather being the silent advocate for you where he would be there when you most needed an elder of someone who you respected present. And that was really lovely to read in your story. What more can you share about the special connection that you had with your mom and your grandfather?
So this is this is hard. It really still grabs my heart, obviously. Yeah, my grandpa was the father I really wanted. I used to have, as a little kid, I used to wish that my mother and my grandfather were were married and were my parents. Like in some ways, I feel like mom and I were, she got me, like she wanted me, and I felt very loved by her. But she was also, as the story went, she was fine until my birth. And then her first hospitalization was when I was 1 year old. And then the one you opened with, the one I remember, is her being taken away by my father and this strange man who was actually our doctor. So that relationship, although I loved her, I couldn't really trust her being there. She was always being taken away. So in some ways, my attachment with her, which ultimately gave me lots of issues with attachment, I had to love her, but also protect myself from her leaving. So the moments I had with her were absolutely precious. Like I remember she was a really cool person. And interestingly, just recently, a sibling of mine, Isabel, in the book, read my book, which I thought was really amazing because none of my other siblings have. And Carl in the book, he has since passed away, and I didn't go to his funeral. So Isabel phoned me, and she had really read the book. And so we had the best conversation that I've ever had with her in my whole life. And in that conversation, she said, I'm really sorry you missed our mother. Like, I thought she was pretty amazing, but my sister told me that I didn't get to see her when she hadn't been affected by illness and her mental health, right? I still miss her.
Of course.
Yeah.
And your grandfather was also very present for you as well.
Oh yeah, he was just the best. He was like everything my father wasn't. He was an elder in the church. He started the first school in the area. He was really into education. He loved being a farmer. He loved animals. He loved horses. He taught me everything I knew about gardening. Like to him it was hugely important to grow a good tomato and to make his garden clean. And he took great pride in his garden, and he did housework. He made the meals. Like he was really a modern guy. Like he was cleaning and doing housework before men were ever. My father wouldn't ever imagine doing anything like that. That was women's work, and it wasn't. It was somehow a reflection on a man if he swept a floor. I mean, I don't know. But my grandpa didn't seem to get those messages, and he was very, very kind. The one when I was going to the 1967 thing in Montreal,
The Expo
the expo, yes,
67. That's right.
absolutely. And I'd been chosen as one of the people to go in the school, and I'd saved up all this money, and I it was $60, and I'd saved up 50. And my mom was going to ask dad for the money because she never had any money. And my father said, no, yeah, I guess she's just not going to go. And I was just devastated. And here's my grandpa sitting there listening to all this, but being very quiet. And before I went out to the bus, he handed me this thing rolled up in his hand, and it was a $10 bill.
I was so happy to read that.
Yeah.
You know what's interesting is you have a huge blow up with your dad later in life. And your mom says to you, I think part of the problem is that you're so much like your dad. But what's funny is when I was reading the book, I'm like, no, Donna is so much like her grandfather.
Thank you. Oh, thank you so much.
And I'll say specifically where he valued education, you valued education. He was involved with the community, you are involved with the community. He was very caring. You are very caring. And so, in these ways, and I was like, how could it be that your father was so different from your grandfather? This was your father's father.
I could never understand that, Fabio. I was like, how did he miss this? Like, how did he miss out having these influences from his own father? And thank you. Thank you so much for pointing those things out because dad couldn't have cared less about education. And here was grandpa, like he built the first school. Grandpa was the one, as I say in the book, I wasn't baptized until I was 7. And he's the one that made sure I got baptized because nobody else seemed to think it was important that Donna got baptized, which is supposed to happen when you're a baby. But I don't know. I have no idea how dad became who he, well, my theory was, and I say that in the book, he took after his mother and he was the apple of his mother's eye. He could do no wrong. So it was like he somehow was allowed to be who he became. And he became not such a nice person. And she was not a nice person. My grandmother was not a nice person at all. Why did my grandfather marry her? But back then, there weren't so many choices, right? Like, so it sort of makes, I guess it made sense that they got married. But even my grandfather and grandmother were, I don't know how they got along. I don't know if they did get along that well, but dad just took after his mother and didn't see the benefit in being the good man he could have been if he took after his father.
And what you're referring to is the first few years of your life, you lived with your grandmother and grandfather on their farm in their house. And your grandmother, your father's mother, was extremely unkind, not only to your mother, but to the kids. She would specifically call you rats.
Yeah. Isn't that awful? Like when we would go into the pantry to get something, like, I don't remember this, but my sisters used to say that, yeah, she'd say, get those little rats out of my pantry.
You know, what's amazing is in reading the book as well, is just seeing the contrast in personalities between your grandfather and your grandmother and your father and your mother. And so, in the same way that your grandmother was detached and neglectful emotionally, your father was that. And then, in the same way that your mother was loving and caring, your grandfather was that. It's just really interesting how these people found each other and were able to build a life together when the personalities were just so different.
I know. It's remarkable, isn't it? My life would have been so different if I hadn't had the mother I had or my grandfather. Some ways they sort of saved me. But you're right, like it's astounding how people get together. I sure don't understand it.
So let's talk about that first memory. You're 3 years old. You are at the top of the house. So you're looking out the window and you see your mom through the window in distress, being forced into a car by your family doctor and your father and being sent away. Not only is she's sent away a number of times throughout your life. And you write that every single time she returned from hospital, that she was different. You didn't quite say it, but I got the sense that sort of a piece of her was gone. Can you describe the impact of that experience on you?
As you can see, it still has an impact. And I was watching this show the other night on TV, and it had this segment about a young boy being sent to a hospital and getting a lobotomy. And I just wept because back then, oh my God, the treatment was barbaric. Like they did, electrical shock therapy. They did lobotomies. I was thinking that when I watched this segment the other night, that I don't know that my mother had a lobotomy. I don't think she could have because she still functioned well, like she still cooked, she still kept the house. But every time she came back, it was like there was a piece missing, like a piece that had been taken away from her.
Do you know or have a sense of what happened to her when she went to hospital?
Oh, gee, there was a time that I wanted to get her records from the London Psychiatric Hospital because that's where she went. And I went through a few of the motions to get them and then really questioned, why am I doing this? Is it going to make anything different? Am I going to understand anything different? I still think about that from time to time, but I haven't done anything about it. I remember watching that Jack Nicholson movie years ago. What was the name?
One Flew Over the Cuckoo's
Yeah.
Nest?
I wept during the whole movie. Like I couldn't, at times I wanted to leave, but and that sort of made me think about what the treatment was like that she got during that time. And the other thing was that she was on medication all the time. She came back with a regular prescription of Valium, of whatever it was that they put her on. And that changes you too, right? Like it was like she was becoming a bit numb. Things didn't affect her as much, which I guess was the whole point. Keep her numb, keep her detached, keep her not reacting. Ah, oh, God, it just makes me so angry that that is how people were treated back then. Because, oh, anger is really bad. Like, you can't be angry. Well, she had a lot to be angry about. And yet, having an emotion about that was treated, it was an illness. Like, it's something you got carted away for, like to be locked up in a mental hospital. So obviously, emotions in our family were not welcome, which was another reason I didn't feel welcome there because I was pretty emotional, but didn't feel like I could be that. Because after all, if you're emotional, then you get carted away to an institution and locked up. Every time she came back, she was a little less the person she was before she went. Like she stopped reading.
What was really sad to read as well is how your family treated you and the fact that they blamed you. They blamed you for her mental illness and would openly say that your birth was the start of her mental illness. How were you and are you able to process that?
Well, I still am. And writing the book helped a lot with that. Writing this book was a huge therapy process. It helped me almost step back from it a bit and realize that, boy, a lot of the things that happened were not kind, not true. And it really helped me sort of see things in a different way. Like the first one that got destroyed in the computer, there was a lot of blaming in it, a lot of anger, and there is in this one too. I don't know that the anger really goes away because like the fact I don't have anything to do with any of my siblings and haven't for years. My life is much better without my family in it. And writing the book helped me with that. Like it helped me get a different perspective. It helped me draw back and sort of see what's really going on here. Like, who are these people? Who am I in relation to these people? Why did they think they could do that? What was wrong with them? And it started helping me see that from growing up thinking there was something very wrong with me, that it changed it around to saying, wait a minute here, what's wrong with them? Why would they think it's okay to treat a little kid like this? And so that helped a lot, like turning it around and seeing, what's really going on here and who's really at fault here.
And there are examples of that throughout your childhood, like the time you write about how you were left in town and they forgot about you. And it was
Yeah.
late on a Saturday. You went into town as a family, they left, you were left behind, you found a way home. And when you got home, you peered through the window and you saw that they were just going about their chores, not even realizing that you weren't there. And the moment that you walk up into the house, your sister yells at you saying, "Why aren't you inside helping out?" They had no idea that you were gone. And it just was so sad for me to read that. And then, you talk about the car accident that you had with Janet and how you flew out of the car and how she didn't even apologize or check up on you. And then that other moment when you had the measles and you were left all by yourself and no one checked up on you. And so these are examples that really struck me in reading your book about how you were really neglected by your family.
Thank you again for pointing those examples out, because as you're saying them back to me, it helped writing them. And as you're saying them back to me, I start thinking, who in the fuck were these people? Like, like, oh my God. So it's almost like when you reflect this back to me, it gives me another feeling of, oh yeah, this is not me at all. Like, I was not wrong in those scenarios. So it's a constant reflection of feeling okay about myself. An interesting anecdote to that car accident thing is that I've had a lot of stuff stored up in my body about that, the injuries that I got through that. And I wasn't taken to the hospital.
And you hit a pole. So just to be clear on what happened, or how about you explain what happened? What happened?
Well, my sister's driving too fast, and I remember feeling, no, slow down because this is not good. You're going too fast. I could hear the gravel on the bottom of the car. Sure enough, she rolls the car, and I get thrown out of the window, the back window, and hit a telephone pole and slide down, and I come conscious at the bottom of the pole. A neighbor runs over. He believes that he's going to find me dead. That's how severe it was. And I come conscious, and my first concern is my mother, obviously. She's in the car, excuse me, but she's protected. And chasing down the road after her friend. So nobody calls the ambulance. And the thing was, they didn't want to call the police because would have lost her license. There would have been a whole big thing about that. And my father made the decision to not involve the police. And therefore, they didn't take me to the hospital, because if they had, questions would have been asked. Like a doctor might have said, how did this little girl get these awful injuries? Like, what is this? So they didn't take me to the hospital for treatment, because that would have meant that the police would have got involved, and the person who would have suffered the consequences of that would have been the police likely would have taken her license, because she was also a young driver. She was 17 years old. And then my father would have also said, oh, gee, our insurance will go up and all that stuff. It was a practical thing to keep her out of trouble, them out of trouble, and had no regard for my well-being.
Yeah, it struck me that Janet was chasing after Betsy, and you, after hitting the pole, you were the only one that checked on your mom, who was basically pinned, not pinned by the car, but she was stuck in this crushed car in the back seat, thankfully uninjured.
I know. It's just an interesting thing to me, and now it's occurring to me, the values in my family were not good values. What kind of value is it when a father thinks about an insurance and what it's going to cost him versus getting the proper treatment for his little daughter? Those aren't right values. And my sister being more concerned about her friend than her mother and her little sister, and losing her license versus getting proper treatment for her little sister. Like, the values were just really, really screwed up. When people lose their values, like lose their doing the right thing, bad things happen.
There was also secrecy that you were dealing with within your family as well. And the first time that you were sexually violated was by your uncle when he exposed himself to you. And what you later found out was that your sister Rose had a similar experience, but that she was caught by your father. She was with your uncle and they were touching each other. And Rose got blamed for that by your father. And it was completely put under the covers. And the only reason why you found out about it was because you shared your story with Rose. And then she opened up to you. Had you not done that, then you wouldn't have known that happened at all.
Exactly.
What I found interesting in your recounting of that story was that you describe your uncle as being mentally delayed. And it was very important for you in your experiences to sort of find out or rationalize the why behind certain things happening. I got a sense that you were able to forgive him. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. I, in some ways, never blamed him. I blamed his mother, my grandmother, and I blamed my father, but I never blamed him. Like yeah, he'd apparently suffered from some, infection as a child. I don't know what it was, but it delayed him mentally. So he never really got beyond functioning of like a 12, 13, 14-year old. Like he never went to school properly. He was good at like being around the farm, and he was good at collecting eggs and working on the farm, but I think he was treated pretty badly too.
It doesn't take away from the trauma that you and Rose experienced by him at all.
True, but again, to me the trauma was more about my father knew that my older sister had been touched and violated by him earlier than me. So my father knew, and my sister knew, that that was going on, but they did nothing to protect me from him. That's where my anger lies with them. They had the knowledge, they had the ability to protect me from that ever happening, and they didn't do it.
And that also speaks to the emotional neglect that you experienced in that family.
Absolutely. It was just another example for me of them not caring or enough to protect this little girl.
After your accident, the car accident that you had, you write that Carl started molesting you over a number of times. You write that it caused a lot of confusion, trauma, you felt violated, and it changed your relationship with Carl forever, obviously. It also changed your relationship even more with your family. You built a wall around yourself. The only time your wall was sort of let down was at school because that's where you really thrived and that's where you really got your validation for being smart. Could you maybe describe, and I know this is a very difficult topic, can you maybe describe what was going on in your psyche at the time that Carl started violating you and in terms of the broader relationship with the family and where you found your outlets so as not to get sucked into the void of depression and despair?
It's all very complex. And I think I figured this out later when I became a lawyer, actually, that the really hard part of being molested by my brother was, sure, the act is awful and shouldn't happen, but the real trauma for me came because I had no one to go to. I had no one that I felt would believe me. I had no one that I felt I could trust to support me, to comfort me, to believe me. That for me was the worst part of it. Like it was the realization I got no one here. No one's looking out for me. No one's going to protect me. My mom was in and out by that. Like I didn't want to burden her. I didn't want to cause her something else to feel bad about. And yeah, I had nowhere to go. I think it was after the accident, like I was fragile, I was injured, and nobody was looking after that. Like I hadn't been treated properly for that. So I think it was almost like the penny dropped. I'm here on my own. I got to do something. I got to protect myself. And so I did. I started feeling like I built a lot of walls to protect myself.
Part of your protection was school.
You have really read my book, and I really appreciate that. And you really get it. So I really appreciate that. Wow. So thank you. Yes, school was you said it so well. The teachers liked me because I was, well, there was that one that I didn't do well with, but mostly, yeah, I worked hard. I was an ideal student. I made teachers look good, and people liked me. Like it seemed like, oh, gee, I'm sort of an okay person out here in this world. Like at home, not so much, but out in this world, I'm doing okay. School became my happy place, my place to go to feel good, and it sort of always was. Education was my escape.
And you excelled at it, not only in elementary school, but you also excelled in it in high school.
Yeah, but at high school was a whole different level, right? Because then it was like I was a cheerleader, I was president of the students' council, I started a yearbook. I was really excelling. I had a great boyfriend. I was not popular with the really popular people, but I had my people, the people that were sort of smart and did well in school. And
You
yeah,
were dating the captain of the football team. I'd say you were pretty popular.
yeah. Good point.
What I found really amazing about your story is that throughout your entire life, it was very easy for you to connect not only with people, not only with making friends and having romantic relationships with people, but they were healthy. What do you think were the factors behind you being able to cultivate healthy relationships outside of the household?
Well, thank you for calling them healthy. I don't know. They were they were healthy in the way that they weren't destructive. I've never been hurt by a stranger, and I didn't attract assholes. Fabio, quite frankly, I'm still sort of figuring that out. Like, what was it? How did I do well? How did I function so well? Because I saw a lot of people that didn't. And I still, in some ways, feel like I'm figuring out how come I didn't self destruct? How come I didn't go down all those really bad rabbit holes, right? Like, I did skirt them. Like, my drinking was at times out of control. I developed eating disorders. It wasn't as though everything was clear sailing and I was happy and doing all the healthy things. Some of the stuff I did was not healthy.
Well, one of the positive influences in your life, if not the most positive influence in your life, was Chris. And he is someone that you had an immediate connection with when you were doing your master's in social work. And you were still dating someone called Fred. And the moment you met Chris, you knew that you needed to break up with Fred, and you did so right away. So I wonder if you could maybe talk about the importance of that moment meeting Chris and the connection that you had with him in the ensuing 4 months that followed.
Oh, Fabio, you're so good. You really picked up on that. Like that's an important point that I don't know if a lot of people would pick up on. Like that need to break up with Fred as soon as I met Chris. And Fred was, I mean, I'd been going with him for 3 years. We were universities, sort of dating, all that stuff, and thought we were likely going to get married. And here I was, the first day of my master's of social work. I sit down, and in walks Chris. I immediately thought he was gorgeous. He had this beautiful smile. He wasn't like gorgeous, gorgeous, but I thought he was gorgeous. And he came and sat beside me. And I was just, oh my God. Because before he entered the room, I was ready to leave. I felt like, oh my God, what am I doing here? I don't belong here. Like, who did I think I was that I could do this? And I was planning my way of getting out of the room as unconspicuously as possible. And then he came in and sat beside me. And then I saw his wedding ring and I thought, "Oh, well, okay. This will be a good friend." But there was something about our connection. It was instantaneous. Like it wasn't something that had to grow. It wasn't something that had to mature. It was like there immediately. And it was mutual. We literally looked at each other and fell in love. Now, I had never experienced anything like that in my life before. I was only 22, 23, and Fred was as good as it got in terms of, well, no, the football captain was the best guy, but Fred was like, I'd never felt that way about Fred. sex wasn't that good with Fred. There was always something missing. It was like, oh, this is the relationship I think I should be in. But as soon as I met Chris, something happened in me that just made me think, oh my God. And it didn't even matter if anything happened with Chris and I. That wasn't the point. The point was something clicked in me that made me think, this is what being in love feels like. And I do not feel this way about Fred. Like there's nothing close to this going on with Fred. It was like, oh, this is how I want to feel. And Fred was just, I got to get out of here. I can't do this anymore. I went home and told him that no, I can't continue this. And he put his hand through a plate glass door and cut himself up. And so I saw a part of Fred that I'd never seen before and felt like, I think it's right that I'm not with this guy. There were all sorts of hints about it before. Like that was the thing. I didn't pay attention to him. Like he was not really that important to me. Getting an education was important to me. Being friends in the circle that I was important. And Finn sort of fit into that circle. Like it was convenient, but it wasn't love. It felt so good to break up with him. It felt so honest and so real. And this, like the spark with Chris, was what ignited the whole thing. It was really like, this is how I want to feel.
You write that it was more than just a physical connection, but it was a spiritual connection. Can you describe that?
It's sort of interesting. And like, these are things that I'm still trying to understand, Fabio, even now. Like, it's like, how do these things work out? Like, how did he come into my life? How did we have that connection? Sometimes I just think there are things going on in the universe and spirits and stuff that just lead us in a certain way. And that was an example of that for me because, like I say, I was sort of inexperienced in that in love. I never felt in love before. I didn't know what it was. Like this is what I mean by spirit. It's spiritual. It felt bigger than us. It felt huge. It felt big. It felt uncontrollable. It felt like this is absolutely meant to be, and there's nothing we can do about it. From the outside, he was married. That's wrong by many standards. It's not something that you go out of your way to do to have an affair with someone, but none of that stuff mattered. Yes, it was physical. He actually taught me how to have an orgasm. I'd never had an orgasm till then. So he brought the physical part of it into my life. Before it felt like sort of a duty or something that I guess I should do. This is expected. Like, but it wasn't something I was enjoying. And I never knew how to enjoy it. And Chris educated me in my body, like how it was supposed to react and how, so that was amazing. But that was just a piece of it. Like he introduced me to a whole way of looking at life, of thinking what life was supposed to be, who I was in life. He made me feel like I was important. He made me feel like I was special. He made me feel smart and attractive. And no one had ever really done that for me before. I marvel at how we came into each other's lives. I still don't understand it. I don't know if I ever will. I just feel so blessed. I would be a very different person if he had not walked in that door. We could have said no to this. Like, we can't do this. We can't allow this to happen. There was none of that. It wasn't as though we could allow it or not. It was there. It was happening. It was meant to happen. He was meant to walk in that door at that time in my life.
It was
And
a love affair, a spiritual connection. It was an intellectual connection that lasted 4 months. And you had a very successful first term in your Master's of Social Work. You made a great group of friends, and some of you decided to celebrate that term before going on co-op by taking a road trip to Florida. Chris was there, as well as his wife and 9-month-old child. There are 2 cars. And you go down to Florida, you have a fabulous time. And then before you leave Florida to return, you're drawing straws to see who's going to be in which car. And of course, you drew the short end of the stick and you ended up going in the car that Chris was not in. And it turns out that on the way back, Chris's car gets hit by a transport truck, and he, his wife, his child, and another friend of yours passes away. That was a huge trauma to you. When I read that, my heart broke for you. I wonder if you can maybe talk about that moment in time if you're open to it.
It still it still hurts. Like when I was reading my book back on the audio thing, I couldn't believe, like, I it was like I was right there again. It was like I was experiencing it all over again and again now. Like it just feels pretty real. And in a way, I guess that attests to how real it was. That the pain of losing him never really goes away. It's not always there, but when I'm reminded, as now, or when I reread it, then it's there and it's all real again. It's like I'd lost the love of my life. No one ever lived up to Chris after that. It was a huge, huge loss. Although we had this amazing group of friends and the profs all loved us and we were excelling and we were stars, burning bright, and then we weren't. And loss of Chris was not only a loss to me, it was a loss to that group. Like we never, he was like the heart and soul of that group. So we never really got it back together again after we lost Chris and our friend. I don't think we did a very good job of, for learning how to be social workers, we weren't doing a very good job of dealing with the grief and the trauma of that at the time. Chris and I had been very respectful and very discreet in our relationship. And because of that, I felt like I couldn't really show how much I was hurting. I couldn't grieve him like I really wanted to. And I mean, I did, but there's still grief there. You know, it's interesting that years later, I met one of the group and we were just walking through a mall or something, and we sat down and started talking and reminiscing about the days of our training and stuff. And then out of the blue, she said, "We knew." And it just blew my mind that they were sort of all in on it.
I read that and I thought it was so beautiful how they kept your connection with Chris safe. I think safe is the right word.
Absolutely. It's the best word. I was thinking, like, they protected us.
So you get your master's of social work and you start a career in that space, and there are some bumps along the road. It's not an easy journey for you. And you eventually decide that, this is not what you want to do in your life as a career, although there were many moments that you had that were learning experiences for you. And then you decide to go to law school. And what I found amazing about your decision to go to law school is that you, on a whim, did your LSAT without studying for it. And you got in, you passed. I was
Yeah.
amazed by that.
Just to go back, I am definitely one of your stumbling spirits.
I think we are all stumbling spirits on this journey.
No kidding. Been a lot of stumbling along the way. But yeah, I woke up one day from a dream and thought, oh, I want to be a lawyer. I didn't even know what being a lawyer meant or how it, what you had to do. And so I asked my physiotherapist at the time, because I was doing physio for my knee. And she said, "Oh, you walk by law school every day when you come here." And I said, "Really?" So yeah, I went back and she told me where it was, and I walked into the office and I sort of talked to this woman that was there, and she said, "Well, first you have to do the LSAT." I didn't know what an LSAT was. I had no idea what she was talking about. But she handed me these brochures and these booklets and stuff. And so I thought, oh, okay. So I studied those and I found out that in a couple of weeks there was an LSAT. They were sitting the LSAT. And talk about ignorance being bliss or whatever. I thought, oh, well, I'll just read these pamphlets over and I'll sort of figure out how this works and I'll go and sit the LSAT. And I did. And I walked into this place. I was like, oh my God. There were like thousands of people sitting in this amphitheater in this huge place at the University of Toronto. And I walked in, I thought, what? What is going on here? They gave me my number and my package and told me where to go and sit. And that, you couldn't go to the bathroom unless you went with someone. Like, it was all very regulated. And I thought, they really mean business here. Like, I don't know what I was thinking, but I did it. I wrote it. I think it was 4 or 5 hours. And I thought, I wonder how that went. But I felt like I sort of felt like I did okay. Like, I didn't feel like I wasn't totally stumped by anything or anything. So I left and I thought, well, I guess if this is what you need to do to become the first step in becoming a lawyer, then I guess if I fail at this, then I guess I'm not becoming a lawyer. And I passed. And then I find out after, like, I write about this, it's like people study for like years to sit their LSAT. There are courses in studying to do an LSAT. I had no idea. And people do it 2 or 3 times before they pass.
That's pretty incredible. I think that's a testament to your studiousness throughout your upbringing in school. I think that's amazing.
Yeah, it really was. Like, I was a good student and I worked hard at being a student. It wasn't something I phoned in. It was always like I worked really hard all through public school, high school, university. Like, I went to all my classes. I did all my projects. I did well, but I never thought it was going to come easy or that it was a shoe in. I just thought, no, if I work hard, I can do this, but I have to work hard.
And work hard you did, because then you go into law school. And that was a challenging time. It wasn't easy for you at all. And that's when some of the challenges with eating emerged for you as well.
Big time. I hated law school. It was totally the antithesis of where I'd been a social worker. People support each other, people help each other. In law school, it's like they do everything to undermine you, to make you look bad, to get a leg up. It's all about competition and I was just like, who are these people? Like, and I'd also gone in later, like I was 28. I was seen as a mature student when I went to law school, and I'd already had this other career behind me. And so I was with people that were there like 22, 23, like younger. There were a few of us that were older, but for the most part, this it was a foreign land for me. It was like learning a different language, and I did not like it at all. But, again, I just thought, okay, I just have to work really hard. But my anxiety was so high all the time. Like, I was afraid of failing. I was afraid of not doing well. And so I turned to food. I became my eating disorder. I didn't even know it was an eating disorder back then. All I knew was I was totally out of control of eating. I ate and I hated myself because of it. And I didn't know what to do about it. I didn't have anyone to talk to about it. I didn't know it was a thing. All I knew was it seemed like in order to get through a day, I had to eat a lot.
At this stage, it was the binging that you were experiencing a lot of, and then it developed into anorexia and also bulimia as well. Your time in law school, you didn't really settle into it until about third year, right? The first 2 years were pretty hard for you.
Yeah, they were. And by third year, like I figured I sort of had it. Like I knew the drill. I sort of knew what I needed to do. I knew how hard I needed to work. I was getting used to the language. I never really got used to the people. So I didn't have a lot of friends. I made a friend the first year, but then she left and went back home. But I didn't really have a group of friends, and certainly no one that I trusted to talk about, my anxiety or my eating issues. So I was pretty lonely. That was a very lonely time. But by third year, I figured out how it worked, and I just sort of put my head down and did what I needed to do.
And then what happened was you did your articling, you wrote the bar, you were called to the bar, and it was interesting for me to read how no one turned up to your graduation. But what was also interesting was that that was the first time that your father noticed you. And he said, if I recall correctly, this is what he said. What were you doing before this?
Fabio, you're astounding. You haven't, yeah, you that's exactly what he said. And it was like, yeah, becoming a lawyer was the first thing that caught his attention. And can you imagine your father saying, well, what have you been doing until now, right? Like, but it was good because it really confirmed to me that he paid no attention, that he knew nothing about anything that happened in my life. And he had no interest. And the first thing that I do in 34 years that catches his interest is becoming a lawyer.
It was amazing to read how you were able to say at that point, I don't need your validation anymore. I'm good. It wasn't something that you articulated to him, but it was something you thought.
Oh, absolutely. I was so done. And it was almost like, thank you. I'm out of here. I don't need you anymore. I don't want you anymore. You mean nothing to me. By saying that, he made it so easy for me to just say, oh, God, I'm so done.
You go into family law and then you go into criminal law. And it was also a bumpy road for you too. And what you noticed very shortly into getting to the profession was that women were not valued. And so at the time that you started practicing was 1984. So it was still a very heavily male dominated field of work. And you had to deal with misogynistic coworkers as well as judges. And this was the environment that you were in. And one of the things that you say is that you had built such a thick skin being around your father growing up that you were able to deal with these people. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Well, that's really interesting, Fabio, because I, on many occasions, thought that my family was the best training ground that I could ever have for being a lawyer. I had a tough skin. I could protect myself. Men didn't threaten me. Like I was used to their crap. I didn't expect to be treated a certain way. I sort of expected the worst and wasn't surprised when I got it. And so, yeah, in some ways, I've got to thank my family because they gave me a great training ground. They were my boot camp for law school and for becoming a lawyer. So, did I care whether a judge treated me badly? I'd been treated badly my whole life. Take a ticket. Like, I don't care. Like, I remember this
Hmm.
once, this judge didn't even recognize me in his courtroom. I was a female. And he was talking to the men, he was addressing them as sir and Mr. So and so. And I just kept talking. Like, I just kept doing my thing. And one who called me Donna wouldn't even call me Miss Armstrong. It was Donna. And he was demeaning. And that was sort of the way it was then, which I'm not saying is a good thing, but that was sort of how it was. I think it thankfully has become much better. And in the course of my career, it became better. But the thing was, like, I became really good because they were so bad. Like Michelle Obama says, when they go low, you go high. I didn't even know Michelle Obama then, but that's what I did. It was like, I'm not sinking to your level. You can be as much of a jerk as you want to be, but that's not where I'm going. So I became better. I became really good.
You became a successful Crown attorney and you were trying sexual assault cases. So it was kind of a full circle moment in terms of you bringing people to justice where you did not receive justice in your own life. What was that like to be able to advocate for people who have gone through sexual trauma?
Again, life brings us to places that I couldn't have even designed that. If I'd planned that, I don't think it could have worked out as well. And I didn't, but becoming a crown, like I knew right away, I knew I wasn't designed for family law. I hated it. When I was fired from that job, I was thankful. When I got the job as duty counsel, which is sort of really low rung lawyering, I took to that like a duck to water. It was like, oh my God, finally, I found the place where I belong. This is why I became a lawyer. This is what I want to do. And then when I got into being a crown, then it was like, oh my God. Now, it was because I was a woman that I got all the sexual assault cases. The men didn't want to do them. Thankfully, women were starting to enter the field, and thankfully, we got the sexual assault cases and we could identify with the victims far more. The big thing for me was I wanted them to have someone that would believe them. Like, I wanted to be the person that believed them and would advocate for them and would help them tell their story. And it didn't matter if we sort of won in the sense of got a conviction or whatever, because convictions were really hard to get. But that didn't matter as much as giving these women, these victims, these people an opportunity to be heard and to have someone believe them and stand up for them. And that became hugely important. So it was a hard time, but very rewarding time too. I say I got good at it. I knew how they felt, but I also now had the tools to separate from it, right? Like I could be the professional, I could be the adult, I could be the person that did a job for them. That being said, it takes a toll. I mean, that's tough work, but I'm glad I did it. I'm glad I was there. I'm glad I was prepared for it. But then I sort of burned out from that. That kind of work is tough, and I realized I was becoming sort of numb to it, like I was not caring as much. And I knew that that was not a good thing.
I did remember reading that. You felt like you were losing yourself a little bit, that
Yeah.
you were so busy trying these cases that you weren't feeling anymore, that you were feeling that numbness, and you knew that that was so problematic that you needed to take a break. And you took a year off, I believe.
Yes. Yeah. I took a year off, which was a big deal because there wasn't such a thing then. There wasn't burnout then. There wasn't looking after your wellness then. There wasn't, it was like a male dominated profession, whereas you went into work if you were sick. That was a badge of honor. But I knew I wasn't doing the job that I wanted to do. And I went to my boss, and luckily I had established myself as a pretty valuable employee because they would give me work, I'd do it well, didn't cause them problems. I'd just do my job. I went in and was going to quit, and they said, "Well, you can't quit." And I said, "Well, I think I can." And they said, "Well, no, we'll give you different cases." They started giving me frauds, which I really didn't care about, and that really wasn't what I wanted to do. "Well, we'll give you a time off. Like, what about a month?" And I said, "You guys are not getting it. This is not a small deal for me. This is huge. And I need more than a month. I want a year off." So we finally struck this deal that they wouldn't pay me to take a year off, which they do now, but they would keep my job for me, which was pretty huge. And so, yeah, I took a year off, and they gave me a big party. It was like I was retiring. I think they didn't think I was coming back. And I didn't think I was coming back. I thought I was gone. Best thing I ever did. I got in my little red Toyota Tercel and drove out west and walked on the Tofino beach for a week. And during that time, I decided that I still wanted to be a lawyer. And then another week, I took walking and decided I still wanted to be a crown, but I wanted to do it differently, but wasn't ready to go back. Like I still needed to sort through a lot of stuff. And it was a good thing to do. I highly recommend taking time off.
You ended up getting a job at another law firm, and it was a different pace, and it was something more manageable where you had more of a work-life balance, right?
It was the best. I came back, and the fellow that I was living with at the time said that this Steve Leggett wanted to see me. Steve Leggett was an icon in the Crown Attorney's system. I didn't even know he knew I existed, let alone here's this guy wanting to see me. And I'm going, oh my God, this is pretty heady. And so I phoned him and he said, come on in. And I went into his office and he said, I want you to come and work for me. And I looked at him and I said, really? Like, but I felt loyal to the office that they'd given me a year off. They'd kept my job for me. I felt like really, and I told him that. I said, I don't think I can do this without talking to the office I'd worked for. So he said, "Whoa, okay, we'll do that." And he got my boss from the other office on the phone, and he said, Paul, I've got Donna Armstrong in my office, and I'm scooping her. And so it was like this funny conversation of these guys, and Paul saying, "You're too important to the system, Donna. If you want to go and work there, that's fine." And that's sort of how it happened. It was very easy. And then I got in an office that was just exactly what I needed. Steve was amazing. He'd give me a case and he'd say, Donna, I'm giving you this case because I think you can do it, but know that my door is always open. That has got to be the best boss you can ever have. He was amazing.
And of course, your career progressed. You worked as a manager in the Crown Attorney Office, and that was really challenging for you for a number of years. But you built a reputation over time, and you eventually retired. Over the years, your connection with your family diminished. It was Thanksgivings and Christmases, and then it was just only Christmases. It wasn't until your father's death in 93 that you pretty much cut all ties with your family. And that was the end of your relationship with your family. One of the things you write about is the one thing that you always wanted was an apology from Carl. You never got that apology. You wanted an apology and you wanted to understand why. Now that he's no longer here, what is it that you reflect on about that traumatic experience with Carl?
I don't know. It's interesting because talk about this thing about spirits. He had a funeral. I did not go to his funeral, but I had a ritual and I got out a bunch of his old photos and I went out in my balcony and I got a candle and I burnt his pictures and I burnt like I'd written a thing about what his death meant and what he'd done meant to me and I wrote a bunch of stuff about that and I burnt that. I don't know, that was meaningful to me. Like that little ritual of burning him somehow was pretty meaningful. And I think there's still something there, but I think it's more on a soul spiritual level than it is in this life level. Like I think I've done what I needed to do to finish any business with Carl now in this life. I feel pretty finished with that. And that feels good.
You open your book up talking about your last day as a Crown Attorney, and you write how you lost the case, and it was a sexual assault case, and you're convinced that the defendants are guilty. And at the same time, you have reverence for the process and for justice. After everything that's happened in your life, do you feel that justice has been served in your life?
Justice is a pretty funny thing. Like everybody has their own idea of justice. Like, is it punishment? Is it the person being found guilty and then there being some kind of retribution or punishment? None of those things really work that well. So I don't know. I like it's sort of a weird for me to think this, but I worked in the criminal justice system for a long, long time. But my idea of justice is very different now than it was then. Then you worked in a system. I worked in a system and you played by the rules and you put a case forward and the jury either found them guilty or not guilty or but there are rules to follow. There's the game to be played. I'm a long time out of that system, like almost 14 years now. I've been retired. I don't see justice the same way anymore. And so when you say, do I feel like I've got justice? I think it's more peace of mind. Like writing the book for me was a form of justice. Doing it in another name, that was protective of myself. Doing the audio thing now in my own name, in my own voice, that feels like justice. Doing this interview with you, that feels very real. That feels very just. It feels very important. People choosing to read my book, that would be a form of justice for me. Like people thinking about their own lives and how they're living and where they come from and what their culture is. And that would be great. So my idea of justice has changed a lot. And like I say, now I feel more like it's peace of mind, being a bit more content with who I am. It sort of doesn't have much to do with what's going on around me anymore or what people do to me anymore. It's got to do with what I do to myself. It's who I am. It's how I behave. It's how I live my life. It's got very little to do with what other people do anymore.
That's a beautiful answer. At the end of your book, you write, "What is the last word I want to utter as I die? Right now, I want it to be thank you. Thank you, universe, for this great life." I found that amazing that you were able to end this book from a place of gratitude. I wonder if maybe you could elaborate a little bit about the journey to experiencing gratitude in your life.
I was just going to say maybe gratitude is a form of justice too. It's really interesting, Fabio, that this phase of my life, I sit here and I think awful things happened. But then it's sort of like, well, if that hadn't happened, then that wouldn't have happened. Like even my accident that caused my knee injury that got me into, like, that was an awful thing. But if that hadn't happened, I don't know if I would have gotten interested in going to law school. Law school was awful. I hated it. But if I hadn't gone through law school, I wouldn't have become a lawyer and been able to do all that good work. So it's almost like you, like at this perspective I can look back at, like, well, that's good. No, that's bad. Well, no, that's good. Well, no, that's bad. So it's sort of like it's like getting the bigger picture. It feels like in some weird kind of way it all makes sense. And so I'm really grateful that at this phase of my life, I can look back with very few regrets, feel like I've lived a pretty good life, and I'm grateful for it all. Like I say, if I hadn't had that family, I wouldn't have had the training ground to become the lawyer I did. So, yeah, it feels good to be at a time in my life where I feel grateful. And I'm back in therapy. And my therapist said, "Do you have a goal, Donna, in being here?" And I said, "Yeah, I want to die well." Yeah, my focus now is like, okay, I want to die well. And what does that mean? Like, how do I live the rest of my life in a way that I will die well? And part of that, I think, very much is being grateful for the life you've had.
What does resilience mean to you?
Oh, God, that word. I feel like my bounce isn't as bouncy. I used to feel like I was made of rubber. Now I'm not so sure. Ah, resilience. What does that mean? I do think it's sort of your ability to bounce back. Like life gives everybody a ton of stuff. It really does. Like you don't get out of this scot free. I don't care who you are. And like some people just have this ability to roll with it or bounce with it or like not let it destroy them, not let it take you into, deep, dark places that you're less likely to get out of. Remember my mom, and you have read this, she said, I was very depressed. I phoned her. It was while I was in law school and I wasn't getting out of bed. And it was Monday morning and I phoned her and I said, Mom, I'm just really, and her in her quiet, very kind way, she said, this is not likely what you want to hear, but she said, please don't dig the hole too deep because you only have to climb out of it. That has played over in my mind a number of times in life. Don't let the hole get too deep so that you can't get yourself out of it, or you don't see your options, or you don't see the light. I think sometimes resilience is just seeing the light.
You mention in your book how therapy, yoga, and meditation are important to you. What other practices of resilience do you have?
Well, yoga and meditation have certainly been my go tos over the last 20 or so years, actually. But also getting to know what you really need, not what somebody tells you you need or what somebody wants you to need or who are you? Like spend some time getting to know yourself. Because what's good for someone and what works for someone may not work for you. Solitude works for me. I like silence. I like being at a cottage all by myself with just the dragonflies and chipmunks and ducks and fish. And some people see that as hell. Being in nature really helps me. Being around animals helps me. I think everybody's got to find their way of who they are. Like, do some digging into what you need, what you want, what is good for you, and then get as much of it in your life as you possibly can.
How do these practices benefit you?
I guess I think of if I didn't do them. Again, it's the negative for me. It's like going to, oh my God, what would I be if I hadn't taken this up, or how my life would be different. And I think it would have been a pretty messy. It was messy, but it would have been a lot messier. Even like now, being in this world now, I feel it's very difficult to be in this world right now. And I think it's more important than ever that we find ways of being kind to people and being kind to ourselves. I'm really sensitive because of my upbringing, because of where I come from, about what's happening to the climate, what's happening to our food sources, what's happening to species becoming extinct, all that stuff. Like that feels hugely important to me. And I despair a lot about how this is all going to turn out. But the resilience in that is coming back to the light. Like there's dark and there's light. So I keep having to come back to things that make me feel lighter, like doing my yoga, meditating, going for long walks, spending time with people that I really care about, and being pretty selective about the people I spend time with. I guess I get back to that creating space for yourself. And so that you can figure things out. Like you can't figure things out if you're running like you're running all the time and thinking all the time. And like everybody needs just a little space. And if you can create that for yourself, that's going to make you far more resilient than anything else you can possibly do.
Donna Armstrong's book is called Getting Here from There, The First 10 Years, under the pseudonym Clara Atmain. Donna, how can people purchase your book and how can they reach you if they want to contact you?
My book is still available on Amazon. Like I say, I'm doing an audio recording and I'm not sure how and where that's going to be available yet. Fabio, if anyone wants to get in touch with me, they can just get in touch with me through my email account, Armstrong_D@Rogers.com.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Donna. I really appreciate your time today. I really appreciate you sharing your story and your vulnerability and being a light for other people. Thank you so much.
Fabio, this has been so great. You asked really good questions.
Thank you for listening to The Stumbling Spirit, Contemplations on the Path of Resilience. This is Fabio da Silva Fernandez. Join me again next week for another episode of transformative stories and beneficial practices to guide you on your wellness journey. If you wish, you can follow and DM me on Instagram at The Stumbling Spirit. Until next time, take a deep breath and another step forward on your path of resilience.